Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk, and thanks for having me here at the University of Ann Arbor, at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor. I should mention before getting started that the project that I'm going to be talking about today is joint work with my two colleagues at the Public Policy Institute of California, Sarah Bond and Magnus Lofstrom. So, as many of you know, there's a fairly sizable undocumented immigrant population in the United States, so roughly 11 to 12 million of the roughly 30 to 40 million people that are foreign-born in this country are actually here under unauthorized status. And this is sort of a level of sort of undocumented immigration in terms of the absolute size and relative to the percent of the population that is actually much greater than at any time in U.S. history. Perhaps the closest approximation, if we think back about our recent history, is perhaps the state of affairs prior to the 1986 passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, when we also had a fairly sizable undocumented population, but more on the order of about 4 million, and it was deemed at the time by the polity to be unacceptable and actually ushered in a really important piece of federal legislation that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. This population poses a number of challenges for the country. Number one, we have the issue that the undocumented population, for the most part, while undocumented, actually has pretty deep roots in the United States. This hasn't always been the case with undocumented immigrants in the U.S. In fact, it's largely the result of a policy of enhanced border enforcement that the country has pursued since 1996, where we've made it impractical for people who migrate here illegally to actually go home. So the people who are now unauthorized in the U.S., if they can get across the border, basically stay, and in the process of staying, oftentimes form families with people that perhaps are authorized immigrants or are legal U.S. residents or native-born citizens. Oftentimes they have children who, being born in the U.S., are citizens. They have long-term jobs in the U.S. and so on and so forth. And for the most part, with the exception of being unauthorized, they're basically residents of the U.S. And so we're not really sure collectively what we should be doing about it. I think that among most people who study the economics of immigration, there's a consensus that the main reason why people come to the United States with unauthorized status is for jobs. And so if we wanted to control unauthorized immigration into the U.S., perhaps what we should do is we start focusing on how we might restrict access to employment. Now, of course, we have a dual problem in the sense that we have a starting condition of the 11 or 12 million, and we have to come up with some way to sort of take care of the existing stock of undocumented immigrants in a way that's humane and wouldn't result in massive social dislocation. Nonetheless, if we really wanted to get a handle and a certain degree of control on our undocumented policy, we'd have to sort of restrict access to jobs only to those that are authorized. Now, in recent years, what we've seen is that the federal government has actually not taken much initiative in terms of trying to either enforce policy that's on the books that we're going to talk about or create new policy targeted towards the employment of unauthorized workers, but states have. So a number of states have taken the initiative on their own to either enhance the penalties under federal law that employers face if they hire undocumented workers, in some cases all employers, in some cases just the employers that contract with the states. And there are even some states that have actually made it a felony for an undocumented worker to look for work or to be employed in the state. And so in essence, what is normally the purview of federal policy has now been usurped by the states, or at least some states anyway. And what this project is basically going to be doing is we're going to be looking at one particularly salient state-level policy, which is going to be the Legal Arizona Workers Act, which is a policy that was passed in July 2007 and made it mandatory that all employers in the states use enhanced verification tools for screening the eligibility of anybody who applies for work in the state of Arizona. And we're going to use that to study how that impacts the internal demographic composition of the state and how it impacted the labor market of the state. And when we mean the labor market, we're going to look both at the labor market impacts of people who are unlikely to be unauthorized immigrants and the labor market impacts on people who are likely to compete in the labor market with unauthorized immigrants. And so this is the result of, what we're going to talk about today is the result of a fairly lengthy research effort by myself and my two colleagues. The results are fairly fresh and new. So this is actually the first time I'm presenting it anywhere, so I'm a little sensitive about my stuff. But feel free to beat me up, because I'm a big boy and I can take it. So you can ask any tough questions you want, and you don't even have to believe me. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to start by just sort of highlighting the fact that state legislative activity pertaining to immigration is actually something that is relatively new, but has hit levels that are very much unprecedented. So what this first table is doing is it's just showing the number of bills that have been introduced into state legislators in the last 5 years pertaining to some aspect of immigration in the U.S., the number of bills that have been enacted, the number of bills that have been, that should say vetoed. That's, well, okay. And what you can see is that there's actually quite a bit of legislative activity pertaining to immigration, which is actually quite interesting, because immigration is actually something that the feds should be doing. Now, not all of this activity pertains to the domain of employment. So, for example, there are many states that have passed bills regulating who is eligible for in-state tuition, and there are some states that grant eligibility to undocumented immigrants and some states that don't grant eligibility to undocumented immigrants. There are some states that make it conditional on having gone to high school in the state, and so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of legislation pertaining to creating programs to sort of foster English acquisition among the foreign-born. Of course, there's been plenty of legislative activity surrounding benefits eligibility for health care programs, whether it be extending Medicaid to unauthorized children or making immigrants eligible for the state children's health insurance program. There's been a flurry of activity surrounding driver's licenses, and especially after September 11th. And the main issue here is that a driver's license for many is basically a license to get on an airplane, and it's basically our substitute for a national ID card for the purposes of movement within the continental United States. And consequently, there's actually been federal legislation that is directed towards enhancing the security of each state's identification system. And with that, there has been a whole series of concurrent state laws passed to sort of govern who's eligible for a driver's license and under what conditions. And you can imagine that there are various different classes of foreign-born residents of the U.S. Who may or may not be eligible for a driver's license. And then the final domain that we'll mention before we get into employment is law enforcement. So there's plenty of state activity regarding punishment and sentence enhancements for human trafficking that usually involves sort of safe housing people who are undocumented immigrants or transporting people who are undocumented immigrants. Perhaps the most well-known piece of legislation was Arizona's SB 1070, which was passed in April 2010. And this was a piece of legislation that basically requires or it enables law enforcement in Arizona to basically arrest anybody who the police officer can reasonably suspect of being undocumented, and then to turn the person over to ICE for deportation proceedings. And it's actually been enjoined by federal courts and still has yet to be enforced in the state. But at least in the popular press, it received quite a bit of attention for being very hostile and anti-immigrant. And then in the Spanish language press, it's reported on all the time. It has been for the months before the passage of the legislation, and it's a frequent topic of conversation. With regards to state laws targeted towards the employment of unauthorized immigrants, we can break the states that have had activity in this area down into a few different types. So there are some states that basically require that all employers that do business with the state take extra steps to make sure that the people that they're employing have documented status. And we'll talk about what those extra steps are in a moment. And then there are other states, so for example, South Carolina, Utah, Mississippi, Rhode Island, that are currently phasing in a universal requirement, which is largely being phased in by employer size, so large employers first, and then medium-sized employers and small employers. And they haven't quite come full into effect, but by 2012, all of those states will have those laws on the books. And all of these states basically are going to enhance the sanctions that employers face for not for not complying with the law and for hiring undocumented workers or knowingly hire undocumented workers. And these sanctions can be anything from a business license suspension for a first-time offense with a fine to a business license revocation for subsequent offenses and then increasingly higher fines. And we'll talk in a minute about what the issue is or what the fines are that we already see in federal law. So the act that we're going to be studying is sort of the first and perhaps the most salient and definitely the most comprehensive of state-level acts, which is the Legal Arizona Worker Act. So as I already mentioned, this was passed in July 2007. It was implemented in January 2008. And basically what this law is going to do is it mandates that all employers in Arizona use what's called the Federal E-Verify system for all new hires made on or after January 1st, 2008, where the Federal E-Verify system is basically an internet-based employment verification system whereby information submitted by an applicant could be entered into at a website for employers that have signed a memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And the system basically checks the person's given information against Social Security records and then also against records at the USCIS to assess whether the person is eligible to work. So the Arizona Act requires that all employers use this for all new hires, with the exception of employers that are deemed independent contractors, which is going to be an important exception. And then it imposes quite severe sanctions for any employer that knowingly hires unauthorized immigrants. Okay, and this is essentially what we're going to be studying. Okay, so what are the three research questions that we're going to be looking at? Well, the first thing we wanted to study is we wanted to say, well, how should we expect the demographic composition of the state to react to such legislation, right? Or how might such legislation impact who resides in Arizona and essentially change the internal composition of the state? And that's the research question that we've done the most work on, and we're going to spend most of our time talking about that today. But we'd also, the sort of subsequent two questions are also important. So number one, has LAO impacted the employment outcomes of undocumented immigrants? Okay, so in other words, has it made it impossible for them to find jobs? Are they still finding jobs? Or has it made it more difficult for them to find jobs, and so they're finding different types of jobs? Or has it altered the sectoral choice that they've made? Are they now self-employed rather than employed? Or are they working in formal sectors rather than formal sectors? So those are the questions we'd like to answer. And then finally, to the extent that the legislation actually diverts labor demand or demand for workers from unauthorized workers elsewhere, does that benefit other groups of workers in the state, right? So do we see that the native-born African Americans, native-born whites, native-born Hispanics, or other workers who are legally authorized to work in Arizona benefit as a result of these laws? And so these are the topics that we're going to address in this question, or in this talk. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the Federal E-Verify program, okay, since that is an important component of this law. So, and what I'll do is just back up a little bit to provide a context or a policy context within which the Federal E-Verify program developed. So prior to 1986 in the U.S., it actually wasn't against the law to hire an undocumented immigrant. right? So if an immigrant was here, they didn't have to present any papers or any sort of identification to be employed by an employer, and the employer faced no sanction for hiring somebody. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't any exploitation or there wasn't differences in pay or what have you, but for the most part, there was essentially no downside to hiring an undocumented worker in terms of an enforcement action. And that changed with the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which is a pretty important piece of legislation in the latter half of the 20th century. And so what did IRCA do? So IRCA did three things. Okay, so first of all, IRCA greatly increased enforcement along the border, okay, largely along the border of Southern California between Tijuana and San Diego, with the idea of trying to deter undocumented immigration across that particular area. The second thing that IRCA did is it created two fairly large amnesty programs whereby all workers who can document, or all individuals who can document that they were in the United States prior to 1982, as well as anybody who can document that they had a certain amount of time working in agriculture within the year or two prior to IRCA's passage were eligible to have their legal status adjusted to becoming authorized. And at that time, those two programs basically granted green cards, right, or legal status to about 6 million people in a relatively short time. And then the third provision of IRCA was that it made hiring an undocumented or unauthorized worker illegal for the first time, and it specified a series of employer sanctions for A, not complying with the employment identification and verification requirements of the law, and B, for knowingly hiring an undocumented worker. And these sanctions raised anywhere from relatively small fines for a first offense to larger fines for a subsequent offense to actually jail time for the employer if they were found to be a repeat, an egregious offender. Okay? Now, how could an employer comply with IRCA, right? Or how do you comply with the provisions of IRCA? So the then Immigration and Naturalization Service had a form which was called the I-9 form, okay? And it's still called the I-9 form. And what you do with the I-9 form is on the I-9 form, the person has to fill out their name, their address, their social security number, and then if the person is not a native, well, actually everybody has to do this, anybody who is hired has to provide evidence of their identification, so who they are, and then evidence of their work eligibility, okay? And there are a number of documents that can establish those two things. So for example, a passport does the trick, right? Or a driver's license in conjunction with social security card can also do the trick. Or if you're foreign born, a driver's license in conjunction with a green card, or I think even a green card alone can do the trick. And in fact, at the time, there were many different documents that immigrants can present, and they would have met the I-9 form, or they would have met sort of the eligibility and identity requirements of the I-9. Now, the problem with the I-9 is that employer compliance basically only required that employer review the documents, okay, that they look at it and they try to assess its authenticity, and then maintain the I-9 form on their records in the event that they were audited by the Labor Department to show that they actually were complying with the law. And what quickly happened over the course of 3 or 4 years after IRCA was that a very abundant market for fraudulent documents emerged, and sort of filling out the I-9 form and complying with IRCA became sort of just an administrative hassle, but nothing that really had any teeth. So nobody really faced any sort of likelihood of being fined because it was very easy to comply. Okay? Now, what the E-Verify program there was some immigration legislation passed in '96 that authorized a series of pilot programs whereby the federal government would take the information from the I-9 form and then cross-check it against Social Security earning records to see whether or not they actually get a match. And if they don't get a match, then they would send a note back to the employer that basically says, we have a tentative non-confirmation. Your employee has 10 days to clear this up. If they don't clear it up, we're going to give you a final non-confirmation, and then the employee, you have to dismiss this employee, and he can't work there, or he or she can't work there anymore. And so that this is, so it was meant to sort of take the information on the I-9 form and actually see whether or not it had any, whether to sort of assess the veracity of what immigrants were applying when they apply for jobs. And of course, just like the I-9 form in general, employers that use E-Verify are supposed to use it for all applicants or all new hires, right? So it can't be selectively applied to the foreign-born as opposed to the native-born. Now, in 2008, what we see is that about 61,000 of the nation's 7.4 million people participate, or are employers participate in the E-Verify program, so it's a relatively small program, right? There's not that many employers that are participating. There have been a number of evaluations of the E-Verify program to essentially assess how often you get erroneous non-confirmations or erroneous confirmations. So in other words, what is the likelihood that I'm authorized to work and I give my information and I get a tentative non-confirmation back? Or alternatively, what is the likelihood that I'm really not authorized to work, but I provide some information and I get back a confirmation from the Social Security Administration and the U.S. Citizen Immigration Services? And what those audits have shown is that the earlier versions of the E-Verify program had a pretty good first-time sort of, fairly okay accuracy, right? So if you were native-born, 95% of the time they get it right. If you're foreign-born, on the other hand, and you were legally authorized to work, oftentimes, at least in the initial pilot programs, you would get a tentative non-confirmation 10% of the time, so even among those that are authorized. In latter evaluations, the system has become much better, okay, and those error rates have been reduced. However, the system hasn't been very good at detecting people who present documents that have been stolen through identity theft. So if somebody steals someone's Social Security card and uses their name and number and supplies that on an I-9 form, for the most part, the system can't tell you this person is unauthorized and that Social Security card is stolen. So it has a ways to go before it is foolproof, and it's certainly small, right? So to go from 61,000 to a national level mandatory program would be quite a jump at this point, okay? Now, what would be the likely impact of forcing all employers in Arizona to use the E-Verify program on the demographic composition of the state? So what we did is we tried to think a priori, okay, about all of the different ways that we think the state's population might be impacted by this new piece of legislation. So first, one might think that the existing undocumented immigrants in the state might leave the state just because it became much harder to find employment. And in 2007, there's a couple of researchers at the Pew Hispanic Trust that estimate that Arizona's population or undocumented immigrant population is about 500,000. In 2007, or 8% of the state. So what we might think is that among this 8%, people might leave just because it is going to be more difficult to find jobs in Arizona than elsewhere. We might also think that future migrants into the state might choose to not stop in Arizona or might choose to enter somewhere else or certainly are going to look to other destinations other than a destination where the information they provide when applying for a job is being scrutinized. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's actually quite common for people who are undocumented to reside with people who are documented and people who are native-born. So given that households tend to migrate together, and it's also the case that undocumented immigrant households actually are quite mobile, so they move at a fairly higher rate than do the native-born or do the authorized foreign-born. We might actually expect that we'd have some population loss of perhaps native-born Latinos or legally authorized Latinos who are just moving because of the impact of the law on somebody within their household. So what we would expect overall is that we would expect the proportion of the population that is foreign-born, that is non-citizen, or that is non-citizen Hispanic in Arizona to drop. And that's the first question that we're going to set out to try to answer, okay? So what this first table is showing is it's just showing our tabulations from some data sets we're going to discuss in a little more detail of what is the proportion of the Arizona population that is foreign-born, not a citizen, or Hispanic non-citizen between 1998 and 2009. And I'm highlighting 2007 as the year when the legislation passes. So it passes mid-year, but it's not enacted until 2008. So what we think, the way we're going to conceptualize our empirical work is we're going to think of the years 1998 to 2006 as our pre-intervention years, and 2008 to 2009 as our post-intervention years. And before getting into the business of trying to find control groups and statistical inference and all the like, I just wanted to show you what the trends are in these three variables. And so what you can see is if we look, for example, at the foreign-born, between 98 and 2006, it hovers between 15% and 16% of the foreign-born. You have the transitional year 2007, and then in 2008 and 2009, there's a notable drop in the proportion of the population that's foreign-born. If we go to the proportion non-citizen, of course the proportion non-citizen is going to be smaller than the proportion foreign-born since it's a subset of the proportion foreign-born. But again, you see relative stability in the proportion of the Arizona population that is non-citizen. And then we have the 2007 legislation passes, implemented in 2008, and you notice declines. And then finally, if we look at the population that's Hispanic non-citizen, okay, which in Arizona is going to be overwhelmingly undocumented, okay, we see that the proportion Hispanic non-citizen ranges between 8.2 and 9.2% in the pre-intervention period, and then by 2009 it declines to 6.6 percentage points. Okay, so if we just look at the data, it does appear to be the case that we're seeing some impact on the population. And so what we want to do is spend some time trying to figure out whether or not that is statistically significant or driven by something else, and then think about what's going to be the labor impacts of this change. This is another just series of tabulations that's just now looking at the residents that are non-citizen Hispanic that are over 15 years old, and it's breaking them down by whether they have less than a high school degree, whether they're high school grads, some college, or college plus. And what you can see is that much of the decline is being driven among Hispanic non-citizens that have less than a high school degree or that are high school grads. And again, that is another sort of dimension along which undocumented immigrants actually are considerably more overrepresented. Okay? So how are we going to do this? Well, what I basically just showed you is I just showed you a trend that we compare the state before and the state after, and we see that there are fewer, that the population that is likely undocumented has declined in California, in Arizona relative to the overall population. And the next thing we want to do is we want to ask, well, is this driven by the legislation? Or is this just going to be driven by the economy or some other factor, or is this happening in other states, or is this what we would have seen anyway if the legislation didn't pass? And so what we're going to do is we're going to employ a method that is referred to as a synthetic control method that basically identifies, what we want to do is we want to find a set of states that if we take an average of their proportion non-citizen, that average kind of looks like Arizona, at least during the pre-intervention period. And if we can find that set of states, you know, whose average looks like Arizona, okay, and that it matches the pre-intervention period, then we can use what happens after the intervention as kind of an estimate of what would have happened in Arizona had the law not passed. And then what we'll then do is compare what happens to Arizona to what happens to this quote-unquote synthetic Arizona, okay, where the synthetic Arizona is going to be an average of a carefully selected set of states that match Arizona. And the way those states are selected is not we're visibly expecting them. We actually use a numerical optimization technique that selects the set of states that's going to minimize the difference during the pre-intervention period between Arizona and what we're going to call synthetic Arizona. So I'll just skip those. Okay, so these are we can talk about that if you want, but this is just an example of roughly speaking what it is we're doing. So you can see the solid blue line, okay, is the proportion of Arizona residents that are foreign-born, okay, in each year 1998 to 2009. And then the dashed line is going to be our synthetic Arizona. And what that is that's going to be a sort of weighted average of a small subset of states. And you can see that I'm sorry?
Tell us which one.
I'll show you in a table. I'll show you in a table, because it depends on, it varies from model to model.
Talk about the data and kind of
Yeah, I will.
reporting issues. And
Yeah, I will. I'm gonna talk about the data in a second. But I just want to illustrate the method, and then I'll tell you what the data is. So what you can see basically is that you know, the synthetic Arizona kind of charts Arizona pretty carefully up until 2006, and then 2008 and 2009 there's a departure. And so the main thing that we're going to be doing throughout this talk is comparing the difference after to what's happening before, okay? Now, how are we going to characterize the impact of the law? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to use something referred to as a difference in difference estimator. And basically, the difference is quite straightforward. We're going to calculate the average outcome for the 9 pre-intervention years for both Arizona and synthetic Arizona. We're going to calculate the average of the outcome for the 2 post-displacement years for Arizona and synthetic Arizona. And then we're going to say, you know, how did the average change for Arizona? How did the average change for synthetic Arizona, and how do those 2 changes compare? That's what a difference in difference is. And so just to visibly show that, right, the 9 pre-intervention years, okay, in this picture are going to be averaged for both groups, and then the 2 post-interventions years are going to be averaged for both groups, and we're going to see whether or not the pre-post change for Arizona is more negative than the pre-post change for synthetic Arizona. And we're going to leave out 2007 because 2007 is a weird year, right? In 2007, the law passes mid-year, although it's not enacted for 6 months, and there's a lot of press coverage, and so everyone is aware of what's going on, and we might expect some anticipatory response. But there might not be anticipatory response. People might be waiting until 2008 to act, and so we're not really sure whether we should be including as a post-intervention or a pre-intervention year. But we'll talk about whether or not our results are sensitive to that. You know, since I haven't told you what synthetic Arizona is, okay, but California is a very important contributor to synthetic Arizona. And so if the people escaping Arizona migrate into synthetic Arizona, then what it's going to do is elevate the proportion immigrant. And so we're gonna show you that that's important, but it doesn't. I mean, conceptually it's important, but quantitatively it won't be. Okay, we'll show you why. Okay, so that's sort of the basic structure. Now the thing that's a little bit more complicated, but it's not too complicated, is how are we going to, you know, let's say for example that we find that in Arizona we have a difference, you know, we have a relative decline in the proportion that is, say, non-citizen Hispanic Arizona. How do we infer whether or not that's significant or not? So what we're going to do is we're going to employ basically a permutation test that's suggested by the developers of this method, and that is also comparable to the results from a recent paper by Bookmuller, DiNardo, and Valletta on the effect of a health insurance mandate in Hawaii. Totally different application. But what we're going to do is we're going to apply our synthetic estimate to every state in the country as if they passed the same law in their state in 2008, even though we know that they didn't. Okay? And then for them, we're going to estimate, okay, you know, we're going to find your synthetic New York and your synthetic Michigan and your synthetic Illinois and your synthetic California and so on and so forth. And we're going to estimate for each state a difference in difference estimate as if the law was passed there. Now, of course, no law was passed there, so these are, you know, quote-unquote placebo estimates, right? And we wouldn't expect to see anything. But if we take the entire collection of 46 states, because we're going to drop 3 in a moment, we'll talk about why, then we can say, where does Arizona fit relative to those 46? So if Arizona's relative change is just in the middle of all of the placebo changes, then it suggests that, you know, even though we see a relative decline for Arizona, it's not significant. On the other hand, if Arizona's change is way in the tail of the distribution, then it seems that Arizona is a sort of outlier, and that's what we're going to do to kind of draw a statistical inference as to whether the changes are significant. And so let's just illustrate that. Okay, so this plate of spaghetti in front of you, okay, is basically if you apply the synthetic cohort estimate to every state in the country and calculate the difference in each year between the state and its synthetic control group and then plot it, that's what each one of these lines are. Okay, so you have 48 of these. And then the red line is Arizona. okay? And what you can see is that this is for the outcome proportion foreign-born, that Arizona is kind of in the middle of the spaghetti in the pre-intervention period, okay, but then in the post-intervention period, Arizona sort of falls to the bottom of the distribution, suggesting that Arizona is a little unusual. So our difference in difference estimate basically calculates the average for 2008-2009, subtracts the average for 1998 to 2006, and we would infer a negative impact if the result is negative. And so we can do that for all 48 of these, right? Or all, well, 47 inclusive of Arizona, and ask where is Arizona? And when you do that, Arizona is in the far tail. Okay, in fact, Arizona has the lowest value, okay? Or we would say that it ranks first out of 47, or that the likelihood of observing a change that negative or less is going to be 1 divided by 47, or 0.02 something. And we're going to say that that's sort of our significance level. And so we would infer then that the change is significant. Because now, on the other hand, if it lied in the middle, right, so if Arizona was smack in the middle, then we'd say, well, this is just the variability that you see in the data. Okay, so we're going to see this over and over and over and over again. So I'm spending a lot of time talking about it because this is kind of what we're doing. Okay? All right. So where does this data come from? What are we doing? We're analyzing data from all monthly CPS, the current population survey files for January 98 to December 2009. We're going to combine files within years, and we're going to estimate the proportion of residents foreign-born, that is non-citizen, that is non-citizen Hispanic. We drop 4 states with kind of comparable state laws that are being debated around the same time that this law is enacted. So we drop Mississippi, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Utah. And then the last thing we're going to do is when we choose a synthetic California or synthetic New York or the synthetic other for all the other states, we're not going to use Arizona, okay? And the reason, or in other words, Arizona won't be in the donor pool, so to speak. And the reason why we're going to do that is because we know Arizona is going to pull, we know that these figures decline for Arizona, and so that perhaps might bias the distribution to the right and bias in favor of finding a significant of Arizona. So we're going to drop Arizona. Okay? Okay. Oh, so Sheldon, you had asked who contributes to the weights. These are the weights, and these are for these 3 outcomes. And it's, you know, sometimes who contributes to the weights is a little more surprising than you would think, but it's basically a data-driven estimator, so we're not hand-picking. When we look at the proportion foreign-born, so what this table is doing is it's looking for each outcome we're going to analyze, and it's showing what are the states that comprise synthetic Arizona for the purpose of this comparison? And then the number next to the state label is the weight placed on that state. So when we look at the proportion foreign-born, we have everything from Alaska to California to Hawaii, Idaho, New York, Oregon, Washington. When we focus on the proportion non-citizen, the weight on California increases considerably, and you get states that look more like immigrant receiving states. When we look specifically at the proportion Hispanic non-citizen, okay, then most of the weight is concentrated on California. And so this issue that Brian Jacob raises about whether or not our migrants are migrating next door is going to be important. So we'll need to address that. But for the moment, I'm just going to show you the results, and then I'll go through these robustness checks. Okay? So I already showed you the outcomes for the proportion foreign-born. Okay, and the proportion foreign-born is sort of a bad one because among the foreign-born in Arizona, roughly, you know, of the 15 percentage points or so, 5 percentage points are citizens. So we wouldn't expect them to be leaving Arizona as a result, or not in large numbers anyway. If we look at the proportion non-citizen, okay, this is what we see. Okay, so synthetic Arizona charts Arizona pretty well in the pre-intervention period, and you get to the post-intervention period, and they diverge with Arizona falling below. If we look at the proportion non-citizen Hispanic, which is now a more narrow group, okay, again, you see a fairly close charting of Arizona's synthetic control group in Arizona prior to the law, and then after you see them diverging. If I show you the spaghetti figures, okay, Arizona's red, okay, it's, you know, sort of in the middle of the distribution or oscillating around the distribution prior and then dips below. And then this is for proportion non-citizen. And the way we can summarize these results is with the following table. This first column right here is showing the average difference between Arizona and synthetic Arizona during the pre-intervention years. The next column is showing the average difference in Arizona and synthetic Arizona during the post years, right? So this is after the intervention, and then that's the difference in difference. So it's just this minus this, okay? And then finally, this is saying where does Arizona fit in the distribution of placebo estimates? So it's the most negative, 1 out of 47, and then that's the proportion of estimates that are at least as negative as Arizona's, which is 0.0201, which was the minimum. Okay, so this is kind of summarizing these results. And so what do we see? What this suggests is that the law basically reduced the proportion foreign-born by 1.8 percentage points, the proportion foreign-born Hispanic by 2.1 percentage points, the proportion non-citizen Hispanic by 1.5 percentage points, if you just focus on panel A. And that for all three of these outcomes, even though they're nested outcomes, it's not surprising, what we see is that the decline in Arizona is larger than all of these sort of fake estimates, right? So it suggests that something real happened in Arizona. Now, what does this mean? So how big are these effects, right? Well, if we have a 1.5 to 2.1 percentage point decline in the Arizona population, where we have 6.2 million people, that roughly translates into a decline of roughly 93,000 to 112,000 people, okay? Which is 18 to 22% of the undocumented population, right? Which is pretty large, actually, if you think about it, right? So it suggests that, and interestingly, the Department of Homeland Security independently has estimated that the Arizona undocumented population dropped by about 100,000. So our numbers are fairly close to what DHS has come up with as well. Okay. Now, I want to spend some time talking about the economic effects, because I think that the labor market effects are frankly what are perhaps more contentious and are actually I think actually being contended in court, or some of the court disputes surrounding the implementation of LAWA. But I want to spend a little bit of time addressing the robustness checks for this population impact. So we explored a number of sensitivity checks, actually more than is on this list, but I'll talk about what's on this list. So one possibility is, we didn't include 2007 as a post-treatment year, and in all those pictures we saw that in 2007, Arizona kind of looks like synthetic Arizona. So we could rerun this, including 2007 as a post-treatment year, we'll get smaller numbers, but we'll do that and show you. Now another issue is the issue that was raised, is perhaps people leaving Arizona, leave Arizona and migrate into one of the states that are important contributors to synthetic Arizona. Now, it turns out that numerically, that is a real problem, right? Because, well, numerically it's not a real problem, but conceptually it's a real problem. Because if people leave Arizona and move to California, then it increases the proportion foreign-born in Arizona at the same time, in California at the same time that it reduces in Arizona, and it would bias that difference in difference to sort of a greater disparity. However, what we see is that our difference in difference estimates actually don't look all that different from just looking at the pre-post change in the series, right? So it's not being driven largely by an increase in the proportion foreign-born among our synthetic Arizona. A second issue is that Arizona is small, okay, relative to California. Okay, so California is almost 40 million people, Arizona is 6 million people. If we take 100,000 people from California, from Arizona, add it to California, that increases the proportion foreign-born in the state from about 0.281 to 0.283. Okay, so it doesn't really have a very large effect. And then finally, what we could do is we can just say, well, let's drop all possible states that border the state from the donor pool and re-estimate the model and see if we get a different number. So that's what we're going to do. Then finally, another thing we might want to do is we might want to test to see whether there is an impact on naturalized Hispanics, because we would think that if you're naturalized, you don't face an incentive to move. So it's kind of, again, another test where we wouldn't expect to find an impact, and we can see whether that's the case. And then the final thing we want to do is say, well, if there was such a population move, we would perhaps expect to see impacts in other areas. So for example, while I'm not going to present these, we actually found that there was, that in terms of the age distribution, this was among school-age kids and adults up to about the age of 40, right? So we might expect to see a same change in the drop of public school enrollment. What we're going to look for in particular is whether or not we can find an impact on the Arizona housing market, and in particular, we're going to look at rental vacancy rates because undocumented immigrants are going to be concentrated in the rental market versus homeowners or owner-occupied vacancy rates where undocumented immigrants are not so concentrated. And so I'll show you what those results look like. So the first panel here is, again, this is that same table, the same structure. First column is the pre-intervention diff between Arizona and its control. The second column is the post-intervention diff, then the difference in diff, then the rank. So in the first panel A, we just redo the same thing, but we include 2007 as a post-treatment year. We still find relative declines in Arizona that are the most negative of all of the estimates for all of the states. They're somewhat smaller, okay, largely because in 2007 we don't see as big a difference as we do in 2008 and 2009, but we still see an impact. In panel B, we reproduce it, and what we do is we drop from the donor pool all of the bordering states of Arizona. We get numbers that are bigger than the numbers when we include all the border states. So we don't think that that's a problem. Okay. Now, what about housing? So before we look at housing, what we're going to do with housing is we're going to do the same analysis, but we're going to look at quarterly rental vacancy rates, which are also collected by the Census Bureau, and then quarterly homeowner vacancy rates. But before we do that, and we actually did this first, okay, so it wasn't that we tried to go and justify this after we found the effect. We thought in our heads, we said, well, how big an impact would we expect to see on the rental market? We reasoned along the following lines. So just as background, if we look at the Arizona housing market, about 30% of Arizona households overall rent, okay, in 2006, as opposed to 56% of non-citizen Hispanic households. So if non-citizens are leaving, we would expect it to disproportionately impact the rental market and not necessarily the housing market. So our estimates are suggesting a 1.8 percentage point population effect, and 29.8% of the population rents. So if we just take 1.8 divided by 29.8, that's 6% of the rental market. So we would think at maximum, if people are leaving Arizona as a result of this law, and it's concentrated in the rental market, we should see a relative increase in rental vacancy rates in Arizona of about 6 percentage points. Okay? So this is our picture for quarterly rental vacancy rates for Arizona and synthetic Arizona again. And the way that this graph is structured, 0 corresponds to 2008 quarter one, and then -10, -9, -8, those are the quarters relative to the quarter when the law was implemented. And what you can see is that you actually do see a fairly large increase in rental vacancy rates for the state relative to synthetic control group. And it seems to be, sort of, it actually is not the largest, we're going to see in a moment, but it is sort of on the outer edge of that distribution. This is the results for homeowner vacancy rates, and you don't see as much, which again makes sense because the undocumented immigrant population generally doesn't own homes or not at the same rate. And then this is where it is in that distribution. And then finally, the bottom 2 rows are, again, the pre-intervention difference, Arizona, for rental vacancy rate, 0.217, the post-intervention difference, 5.8, and then the difference in difference, 5.5. So in other words, it's saying, the estimate here suggests that the law increased rental vacancy rates by about 5.6 percentage points. And indeed, there was press coverage in the aftermath of this law by, surrounding Arizona, where landlords were complaining that they had empty apartments as a result of the law, right, because people were leaving the state. And we find some evidence of that in the data, okay? Okay, so that's the demographic composition bit. Now, do I have till a half hour? Or?
We go till 5:30, but that would be
Okay, so how about I just 10 more minutes, okay? I promise. I won't. So the last bit, since this is where we've done some work, but we don't have as much work on it as yet. We wanted to study the impact of the law on the labor market impacts of residents that are left behind. And we would think that it might have an impact along a number of dimensions, right? So if you stay behind and a lot of people have left and there's still employers willing to hire you and violate the law, then in some ways you have less competition and you may benefit from people leaving the state. On the other hand, if employers are complying with the law, right, then it might become much more difficult for you to find work. So we might expect your employment rate to decline, or alternatively, we might expect you to move into other sectors. Now, one of the interesting things about LAWA is what LAWA did is it exempts people who are independent contractors. Okay, so if I'm a construction general contractor and I hire somebody on an independent contract basis to dig this gas line, okay, I'm not subject to the law. So one of the things I could do as an individual worker is I can go from being your employee, okay, to being a self-employed worker that contracts with you to do work for you. And so we might see that kind of response. And we, normatively speaking, we think that that's bad, okay, right? Because it basically removes the employment relationship outside of a lot of public policy governed by U.S. labor law. And we don't think that that's necessarily a good outcome. Now, we might also expect LAWA to impact the labor market outcomes of immigrants legally authorized to work in the U.S., right, through a number of channels, right? So it could be that there's less competition with undocumented workers, they do better, okay? It could also be that, if we conceptualize the law as increasing the labor costs of employers, that there's a negative scale effect on the demand for all workers, including workers that are authorized. It could also be the case that, enrollment in the we know that enrollment in the E-Verify program actually wasn't universal for Arizona employers. Okay, so not everybody used the law. And what Arizona employers may be doing instead is they might say, well, what I'm going to do now is I'm just not going to hire anybody who is Hispanic and speaks with an accent, okay, which could be many people who are legally eligible to work in Arizona. Okay, or in other words, they can statistically discriminate against those who they perceive to be of high likelihood of being undocumented. And indeed, in earlier research that I had done with Cynthia Bancik, we found evidence that occurred after the Immigration Reform and Control Act, that employers increased discrimination against legally eligible authorized workers. But at the same time, there's also theoretical arguments that might suggest that there's reduced discrimination by employers against the authorized, where the idea is simply that if employers use E-Verify and they get an unambiguous signal from the federal government saying that this person is confirmed authorized or this person is final non-confirmed, then there's no room for employer discretion, right? Because they actually check a record. And in some work that Harry Holzer and Michael Stoll and I have done, we found that in a different context, that when employers actually check criminal background records, that they're more likely to hire black men, which suggests that when they're not checking criminal background records, they're inferring that black men are more likely to be criminals when they're not, and then they're not hiring them, right? So the discrimination story can go in many different ways, and it's quite complex. Now, just I'll give you a quick review of what we find. This is a comparison of the employment to population ratios among Hispanic non-citizens in Arizona. And we see a slight decline in the employment to population ratio, but it's not statistically significant. This is the self-employment rate. Okay, so the proportion that among those who are employed, or actually among all of them, the proportion that indicate that they're self-employed goes up quite a bit in Arizona, okay, among non-citizen Hispanics, while the proportion that indicate that they have a wage and salary job, in other words, that they're employed by somebody else, actually goes down, okay? So it goes down by quite a bit. So there's not a whole lot of evidence that those who remain behind lost employment, but there's pretty strong evidence, okay, and the changes are statistically significant, that those who remain behind are shifting in a decisive way from wage and salary employment into self-employment. Okay, so we are seeing that. Just to summarize what we're finding for impacts on natives, there's a very large literature and a fairly contentious literature analyzing what the impacts of labor market competition with immigrants are on native-born workers of different skills, where presumably we would expect those native-born workers that look most like immigrants in terms of their education profile and their age and their general skills to be most negatively impacted by competition with immigrants. We looked in many different areas to try to see whether or not the diversion of people out of Arizona or the diversion of labor demand from unauthorized migrants to others had any positive effect on anyone, and we couldn't find any evidence of a positive impact on low-skilled whites, low-skilled blacks, native-born Hispanics, and so on and so forth, right? So we really couldn't find any evidence. Of course, this entirely could be confounded by the fact that the economy slips into recession, okay, in 2008 and 2009. But for the most part, at least where we stand now, we can't find any impact. Brian?
I just had a question related to that. I mean, I thought that maybe I'm not understanding the vertical axis, but this was at the end, this was a period of huge unemployment increases. And I don't see that much happening in the control group. So it's just, they're not much, like the mass unemployment was not affecting non-cis and Hispanics in California, Maryland, Arizona? Or like what?
Well, these are employment to population ratios, okay? So they're going to move less than the unemployment rate, I guess. My co-author has taken these weights and applied them, so he basically, I should have included this graph, took the weights and charted out the state unemployment rate for the synthetic Arizona and for Arizona for all these charts, and they sort of lay right on top of one another. He's also looked at sectoral level employment totals, so construction, compared it to California, compared it to regions of California, so the Inland Empire, all Southern California, which is much like Arizona, and you don't see disproportionate large declines in, or you see large declines in construction employment, but you don't see larger declines in Arizona relative to California. So in terms of the economy, we don't find much, or at least the robustness checks we've looked at, we don't seem to find a disparate impact of the contraction in Arizona relative to other states.
Yeah, no, I guess, I mean, I wasn't thinking of differences. I was thinking of just not any problems in differences, but just the fact that there wasn't much, the graph makes it seem like there was not much change in employment.
It's still 5 points, an increase from 5 to 10% in the unemployment rate. That's a drop in the peak from, what, 64 to 60 or something?
At 60.
So,
I don't know if I can quickly do that in my head. But so the first of all, we have a different denominator because this is employment population.
Why use that rather than unemployment rate?
That's a good question. I think the reason why we're looking at the employment to population ratio was we didn't want sort of discouraged workers or people who are dropping out of the labor force who are saying that, you know, to sort of bias so we just wanted to see basically something like an employment probability, okay, and assuming it's relatively stable over time. We did it by gender, right? You find basically all of it is concentrated among men, or a good chunk of the effects are concentrated among men. In terms of the self-employment, well, this is actually interesting. When we compare these self-employment wage and salary employment rates by gender, we find that it is nearly all concentrated among males, right? So you don't see much of that among females, again, which is consistent with what you would expect. Okay, so I just went through like 20 slides for the quick, but I'm just going to go to my conclusions and summarize, and then we'll take questions, okay? All right. It's there somewhere. Okay, so what did we find? Okay, so we think we've documented sizable population responses among non-cis and Hispanics, and a notable shift of non-cis Hispanics out of wage and salary employment into self-employment. And then finally, as I kind of glossed over, we don't really find much evidence of an impact on the employment rates of the native-born of any race, ethnicity, or education level. Now, there are a couple of additional thoughts about the topic before we open it up. I think one of the limitations about thinking about what might happen if we were to implement E-Verify sort of nationwide is the fact that when something is implemented in one state, it's pretty easy to migrate to other states. right? So you have other options. In fact, you have 49 other options. Not practically speaking, but you have other options. It's not too far to get to California or to go to another state. On the other hand, if we were to implement this nationwide, my guess would be, right, that we would have much less response along the sort of quantity margin, right, so many fewer people leaving, and much greater responses along the margins of sort of working and informal employment, or perhaps lower employment rates among those that can't find jobs. So it is interesting. I think we can learn something from studying state-level immigration law, but as being instructive for federal policy, I'm not sure what we learn, okay?
We know that Arizona passes a whole bunch of laws after this. So in general, the experience of living in Arizona as an undocumented person, regardless of whether you're a worker or not, is changing substantially in this period. So have you thought about how you could show results that show that this is particularly the labor market issue rather than just general?
Well, the main subsequent piece of legislation in Arizona is SB 1070, right? And then there was an addendum to SB 1070 that softened SB 1070 a little bit. And that passes in April 2010. So that's one of the reasons why we stopped our analysis 2008, 2009, because we knew that once we get into 2010, then you've really contaminated you have, nothing's contaminated, but it could be other things that are driving it. And still, we would have to admit that it could be the case, right? I mean, when a bill passes in April, it means that there's a legislative debate preceding it, and part of the response that we could be observing in 2009 might be anticipatory in response to what subsequently passed in 2010. So that's an important qualification, right?
I have two questions. One is, I'm wondering if there's anything happening in enforcement, in federal level enforcement along the Arizona border at this time that might serve to deter more immigrants across Arizona, move them to Texas or to California or other entry points during this period, or whether. And obviously this kind of thing, as you know, changes all the time, but whether there's anything consistent that you might need to pay attention to. Mm-hmm. And then my second question, sort of along these lines, is we don't, obviously from CPS data, it's not obvious how you would be able to figure out whether these are people who had lived in Arizona who are leaving versus people who are deterred from going to Arizona. And of course, then the question is, and then do they go elsewhere or do they just stay in Mexico? And of course, that intersects with the recession.
Right.
A little bit later. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, those are two, and both questions are related, right? So what we think is going on, and what we think the evidence shows, in particular in conjunction with rental housing estimates, is that actually this is being driven by population loss, okay? Largely because you see, a rental market, sort of a fairly pronounced and sudden increase in rental vacancy rates. And so I guess if we were in a world where the Mexican population was highly dynamic in the sense that it was flowing into and out of the state at a relatively high rate, then it could be that cutting off the inflow can cause a big increase in the rental vacancy rate. But I don't think that characterizes what's happening in Arizona. I mean, it could, because Arizona is a sort of pass-through state. So we can't really, address that because we don't have flow data. We're looking at stocks, and then we're inferring something about the flow. I mean, one thing that we could do, and it's sort of on the list of next steps, is to look at school enrollment and to see whether or not we see declines in school enrollment consistent with the data. And again, it's another stock measure, but still, one might expect that school enrollment would be, or a change in school enrollment would be a change associated with established households rather than people that are migrating in and putting their kids in school and then other kids replacing them and so on and so forth. So we'll do that and we'll see. But my gut feeling, just by looking at the housing market data, is that it's not a replenishment issue, it's that people actually left.
And the concentration on the border?
Oh, the border, yeah. So, that I don't know. I don't know what's happened to border enforcement. I mean, I know that border enforcement has been enhanced, and that's part of the reason why Arizona became such an important destination place for undocumented immigrants, partially because we enhanced enforcement in California, right? And then it just pushed people further into the desert with, again, in many instances, tragic consequences. But I don't know over this time period whether or not there was enhanced enforcement along the Arizona border or whether it's constant. So that's something we could probably look into. So we could look at apprehension data, or we could get some sense of what's going on there. That's a good suggestion.
Hi, I have the data question that Ann has from the opposite point of view, which is that the post-program period coincides with a huge economic crisis. And it's especially huge in Arizona. And immigrants in Arizona are relatively new because of this border enforcement policy, sending them to Arizona. One possible way I thought about that might help you sort of get at this is the rumor was that lots of people were moving back to Mexico, right? That it wasn't just deterrence because of the economic crisis, but the people were moving back to Mexico. But if you took a look at the CPS data over time, and when people came to the United States, one would expect that the people who were here for the shortest amount of time were the ones who would go back to Mexico during the economic crisis. And so if you saw that that was stable, it might work against that argument. But if you see
So you mean
changes,
the distribution by year of arrival?
yeah. So if that doesn't change, then that would sort of help say, no, it's not just that, folks are seeing the economic crisis and they're all going back to Mexico, right? But if it does change, then you might want to
Right.
sort of think about that a little bit.
Right.
And the same thing with the economic crisis and the employment figures. If you believe a last hired, first fired kind of argument, that might play a role in it as well. So I don't know, have you thought about that? There were bad years.
Yeah, they are bad years. I should make a plug for a Michigan graduate's paper, actually. There's an interesting paper by Brian Cadena, and I can't remember, I was talking to somebody at lunch today, I can't remember his co-author's name. Another Brian Kovac. And what they do is they analyze how variation in demand in the United States, as measured by the unemployment rate, impacts migration from states in Mexico, where the states are basically weighted by the proportion of Arizona residents from that state, right? So it's sort of, in other words, when the conditions in the United States that are sort of, that reflect where your people are, okay, in terms of your village or your state or whatever, how does that impact migration? And they actually find that there is, to get back to Ann's question, that there is a migratory response when the economy slows down. And so this is a real issue, right? That 2008 coincides with this very sharp decline in the Arizona economy. And you're absolutely right that Arizona's crisis is on the severe side of things. I mean, the whole country's crisis is quite severe, but Arizona has a very high foreclosure rate. Arizona has a relatively high unemployment rate relative to other states in the country, and so the downturn was quite high. Now, we did spend some time trying to compare Arizona to the states that comprise the synthetic control, and we don't find higher unemployment. I mean, we don't find a higher rise in unemployment in Arizona relative to these other places. And then we also did this sectoral analysis where, we looked at construction employment in Arizona relative to donor states, and we didn't really find that Arizona's construction plunge was any worse than it was in other states, in particular in California, right? Since California was such a large contributor to the synthetic comparison. But at the same time, I think that's in many ways kind of the Achilles heel of this analysis, right? That it's just unfortunate that LAWA happened to pass at the same time as we had a massive recession. So we can do what we can do, right? Kevin?
Sorry, this is another just sort of data question / suggestion. I mean, I think it'd be really interesting that if you were able to sort of nail down the the flow response to really sort of pick up where they went. And so I was wondering if, doesn't the American Community Survey have like where you lived a year ago? You wouldn't have as many sort of
Yeah, it
pre-period
does.
years, but
There are a
it
couple
may be
different
sufficient.
sources. I think actually the CPS has migration data too. I think March CPS does, and the ACS asks. And then also when this wouldn't work, but the IRS generates a migration series based on tax exemptions and how they change across states. But presumably, undocumented immigrants aren't filing tax returns, so that would make it difficult. We couldn't use it.
Right.
But that's a good suggestion. We haven't done that yet.
I mean, you'd lose like several years of pre-data, but maybe you have enough. I mean,
Well-
it goes back to like, I don't know, 04, 05.
Yeah, what we were actually waiting for, so we stopped working on this right before teaching started, which was, sort of September, I think, and we were waiting for the 2009 ACS to actually be released, and I think it's been released in October, so was it last week?
Farley has it online.
Okay, all right. So we're going to redo this analysis with the ACS, and then we can look at that migration issue. So we can see, I guess the idea would be, do we have 100,000 non-Hispanic or Hispanic non-citizens outside of Arizona that used to live in Arizona in 2009, 2008? That's what we need to look for. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Is there-
Do we have enough one?
Anya?
Okay. This is the last one.
This is a question about effect on native-born. I mean, one thing that makes Arizona a little bit odd in terms of proportion of native-born and unemployment rate, low-skilled, is the high, relatively high percentage of Native Americans in this state. And, with particularly rotten economic outcomes. And so I'm just wondering whether, I would not guess, given the structure of that population, that losing, that there would be much substitution between Native Americans and the undocumented population. But I'm wondering if that sort of props up or makes the impact sort of look more steady state than it otherwise might.
Well, because since we didn't analyze, well, I don't know what fraction Native Americans are of the low-wage workforce. That's something that we can tabulate and look at. I mean, we looked at, native-born whites, native-born blacks, native-born Latinos, and we didn't find anything. In fact, we would expect among native-born Latinos, and even among, frankly, naturalized citizen Latinos, that we would have seen some sort of response, and we didn't find anything. Now, of course, it could be that 1.8 percentage point decline is just not big enough, okay, to generate an impact, especially when, it's kind of like you have a little dose in this huge, haystack of a recession, okay, and then you're looking for an effect, and so we couldn't. That could be what explains that. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.